continuing the way they are, or absolute catastrophe. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Or as I think Zizek put it, it's much easier for us to imagine an apocalyptic disaster than it is to imagine some just small changes which might make life a little, and the economic system a little bit more humane. And there's a kind of way in which we've all, and I'm including myself in this, are infected by this inability to see anything differently, which is why I think there's such a great appeal for many people, and I totally include myself in this, for these apocalyptic narratives. If there are things we don't like, the only way to imagine getting away from them is if there's absolute destruction and life or civilization or something that collapses utterly. And just think of all the post-apocalyptic narratives which have been popular in the last years. I'm thinking of Cormac McCarthy's The Road and the movie made of it, but there's, or the movie which Fisher talks about, Children of Men, which imagines a world in which people don't give birth to children anymore, so we have an aging population and the end of the human race in prospect. We're haunted, Fisher says, by the widespread sense, not only that capitalism is the only viable political and economic system, but that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. So this kind of, imagine we have a limited imagination. It seems that the future harbors only reiteration and repermutation. Could it be there are no breaks, no shocks of the new to come? Even as we live in a society where everything's new, I broke down and bought an iPhone 4, even though I had a previous iPhone, and Apple's, slogan of that was, everything's completely changed again. I mean, so every 6 months we have a new novelty, and it's like everything, this changes everything. I think this changes everything again. But of course, if this changes everything in every 6 months, it really means that nothing's really changed. The iPhone 4 is a little better than the previous one I had, but it's a few minor tweaks. And we sort of find ourselves in this kind of thing, instead of having like science fictional imaginations of radical difference and all these other things, we have an imagination which has become kind of, I'm talking about a general cultural imaginary, it's become kind of stuck in repetition, stuck in either more of the same or just description. Even if you look at, and I was talking with some people about this earlier, another thing I'm writing about elsewhere is science fiction narratives, and I published an article I published an article about science fiction and serious things about what's called the singularity. So the singularity is the idea because computers become so powerful, we'll pass a point where everything's utterly different. Either machines will so far outpace us, or we'll be able to just download our minds into machines and be free of our mortal bodies. And what's noteworthy to me about this, the people who take this very seriously, and I claim this is going to happen like by the middle of this century. I'm dubious about that, but what really strikes me is that even though the basic premise of this discourse is that everything's going to be so radically different, it's going to be such a radical discontinuity with the entirety of human history up to this point that we can't even begin to imagine it. They do begin to imagine it, and it's really basically that everybody has the lifestyle of California software entrepreneurs. I mean, there's really nothing different about it. If you read something like Ray Kurzweil's books about the singularity, this is what you get. I just see, there's a kind of, I feel this kind of this malady of the imagination, and that we're sort of trapped in it. And I was looking at Eastern European films to see a way, if they might offer, because of their unusual perspective from my point of view, a way around this. Now this obviously has to do with the idea of communism. And in fact, there's been a lot of, on the intellectual left, there's been a lot of talk recently about what Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, calls the communist hypothesis. And this itself is I think a certain confession of the same weakness that I've talked about. What people like Badiou and Zizek and others offer as, under the name of communism, a name they're reviving precisely because communist parties were thrown out of power, and the few communist parties still in power, like in China and Vietnam, are pursuing capitalist policies. Everything's capitalist now. There's no more communist world or socialist world or however. They are reverting to both to the history of communism as dating back to the 19th century as a hope for human emancipation, and to the idea that the failure of actually existing socialism or communism actually leaves it as a kind of ideal, something to strive for. So it's a name they're giving to the possibility of something which would be different from what we have now, something which would be less individualist, with a more sense of solidarity and community among people, and so on and so forth. But again, it's hard. Communism for Badiou is what Kant called an idea with a regulatory function rather than a program. Nobody has concrete visions. It just it's almost like an ethical injunction. We must imagine things differently and better, and this is the name under which we can. But again, it seems to be an idea empty of content. So that's another starting point. Part of my idea is that Eastern European films in this respect, and I'm not saying everyone, but the ones I'm looking at and others I could also look at in this project, are sort of doing two things. One is they're making capitalism as uninevitable as socialism turned out to be. And number two, they're displacing our sense that the only horizon we have is this capitalist horizon, and so they're looking at something differently, which maybe can be named communism, though I'll leave that open. What bothers me about people like you especially, and Zizek, people who've been using this rhetoric more is, and this goes back to what we just heard called a political turn here. Actually, I'm not very much in favor of a political turn. In a certain sense, I'm more in favor of a kind of economic turn, in the sense that this is partly my own political vision. What's problematic now is that we're cutting all these programs and we're gutting education systems because we can't, we could never have the banks not have their mega profits. So that's a kind of cheap populist way without the kind of analysis I prefer to have at more time. But anyway, I've actually been drawn back to the great Marxist critic, now retired, Frederick Jameson, who talks very interestingly about politics and economics. Jameson's long written about what he calls the utopian, and I always used to poo-poo this idea of the utopian, because utopia to some extent means an idea of perfection. Now, if something's perfect, that means it doesn't change anymore. It's just like in stasis, and stasis is kind of horrible. Of course, capitalism is a dynamic system precisely because it promises continual innovation, continual revolution of everything. Though, as I said about the iPhone, the revolutions turn out to be less than really radical. They're just sort of continual improvements which force us to upgrade and get new products and so on and so forth. And I don't scorn getting the new products and having the new powers which the new products give. But again, the question of utopia has become more interesting to me in recent years, and I brought it back to Jameson partly because of the way in which, again, this whole discourse of there is no alternative, we cannot think anything different from what we have now, except for tiny incremental, tweaks here and there, is sort of based on a kind of idea that what was wrong with everything bad in the 20th century, and people would include both communism and fascism, Nazism into this, is that they were utopian. They thought you could change things. They thought you could make things better. And whenever you try to make things better, what results is absolute horror and destruction and murder, mass murder, and things like that. I basically can't accept the idea that the very act of wishing things to be better and different means that you're committed to, basically slaughtering millions of people. And I don't think it's an accurate account of what led to the atrocities either of Nazism or of communism. This is again a thing which one could talk about for hours. But it made me think that if the idea of the utopian has become taboo just because it's taboo to even think that things could possibly change at all, that it might be worth looking at this now. And indeed, Jameson has toned down what he says about utopia. He himself also says, as in things he was quoting before, the radical break of secession of utopia from political possibilities as well as from reality itself accurately reflects our currently ideological state of mind. That's from his book on science fiction from a few years ago. He's basically saying that he's saying also we can't imagine something different. So all we can kind of imagine is the negation of what we have now, saying these are not our limits. We can do something beyond that. We can't really tell what that is. And that's sort of like the position both of these sort of people who talk about the singularity, but can't imagine it being any different from their current California lifestyle, and talking about the impossibility of imagining beyond this horizon. Utopia, Jameson says, a meditation on the impossible and the unrealizable in its own right. And I think, again, critical films, and I think all the films, the three films we read, are all very socially critical of their societies, are ones which don't propose a positive program different, but do try to think the unthinkable, try to push us to the point where there's something unthinkable, impossible. And maybe if we entertain thoughts, possibilities would change. The question of what is possible, what isn't, might change. That's the sense in which I can give to utopianism in Jameson's sense now, and why I regard the word more positively now than I used to. Jameson also says something else very interesting from another text. And what he says is that he's basically, in terms I find congenial, criticizing the political turn, what you've been calling the political turn. It has often been lamented that Marxism seems to be a purely economic theory, which makes little place for a properly Marxian political theory. And I believe this is a strength of Marxism. And then he says, there can never be satisfactory political solutions or systems, but there can be better economic ones, and Marxists and leftists need to concentrate on those. And again, that to me displaces the whole idea of utopia. To talk about economic systems, and I mean, you know, it's like, it seems to me to ask the question to the bank, do we, in order for credit to be spread around so that industrial things can happen, so things can be created, do we really need banks which can siphon off so much money, which is the total center of social power? That's a different question from saying, can we really get a perfect system which will repair the way in which things are insufficiently democratic? It may well be, my anti-utopian side says we'll never have a perfect political system. But my utopian side says that to say, therefore, we're consigned to what we have now ignores the question that there are arrangements which might involve relations among people in various ways which could make things different. And so the negations of these films seem to me to be ways of negotiating these differences. So I've taken a lot of time in that, but that's sort of the philosophical premises behind what will now be mostly just sort of close readings, or very abbreviated, because any one of these films I could easily talk about for over an hour, and I just don't want to do that. So I'm going to be very brief, but I want to talk about a couple of these films and suggest that they offer interesting prospects. Okay, the first film is, I wrote here this on a lot of grotesque stuff. The first film is a young Hungarian director, György Palfy's Taxidermia. Okay, it's based on some Hungarian short stories which haven't been translated, so I can't read them. It's a film which is, again, but the film is accessible, and it's available on DVD. You can actually stream it over Netflix if you, after I show you a clip, you still want to see it. It's on the one hand, it's a real body disgust film. I mean, it's very visceral in a kind of disturbing, Cronenberg-like way. At the same time, okay, here I'll read what I wrote. On one hand, Taxidermia is a highly controlled, severely formalist film, and its nearly inhuman detachment and its rigorously schematic organization. It's as severe as anything by Kubrick. At the same time, it is filled with uncomfortable and unpredictable details, and it insistently focuses upon the excesses of the flesh in a way that rivals early Cronenberg. Okay, so there's a kind of contradiction between its icy formalism and its visceral disgust and its exploitation of visual disgust, as between its interest in body affect and how feelings are conveyed in the most direct length on the body, and in its very kind of abstract allegorical look at different social systems. It's a film divided into 3 parts. It tells the story of 3 generations of Hungarian men, though it's worth noting that in all cases, in both of the passages, first, second, and second to third generation, there's dubious paternity. So you don't know whether these 3 men are really biologically descended from each other, even though they appear to be. And these 3 divisions of the film, which tell 3 separate stories of these 3 generations of men, all are set in different political, social, economic regimes which Hungary has underwent over the course of the 20th century. So the first part takes place during World War II, when Hungary was ruled by a fascist government in alliance with the Nazis. The second part takes place under communism, not the Stalin's communism in the immediate post-war, but the communism in the 1960s. The third part takes place, though the dates are ambiguous, takes place in the post-communist or post-socialist or capitalist present. Each of the three sections deals with a protagonist who's a man who's troubled in one way or another, and basically the film sort of combines these 3 regimes of masculinity or masculine dysfunction, let's say, with the 3 political regimes. So the first part is about a soldier, Vendel Morashka,